Hi everybody, and welcome to Cicada Innovation's monthly buzz event, and the topic today is all around space. So first up, I'd love to introduce Donna Lawler. Donna is a principal at Azimuth Advisory, and she's a member of the International Institute of Space Lawyers. Welcome, Donna.
Hi, lovely to be here, Sally.
I had no idea that there was such a thing as space lawyers, but I've now decided that you are the coolest legal eagle on the block and definitely the lawyer that I want to have in the room. Next up is James Brown. James is the CEO of the Space Industry Association of Australia, and it's Australia's peak body for the space economy, and it's an emerging economy and a growing economy. So James has the terrific job of having to keep up with that, which is no mean feat. Welcome, James.
It's no mean feat, but a lot of fun. G'day, thanks for having me on.
Oh, look, I'm excited, and I'm sure you've got something that's happened in the last day or week that, we haven't heard of yet. So it'll be great to unpack that and dig into that a little bit more. Next up, we've got Tim Parsons. So Tim is the SmartSat CRC New South Wales Node Coordinator. He's also been a founder and a co-founder or a C-suite member of 5 tech startups over the last 12 years and is passionate about space. I think passionate is actually probably an understatement. I'm not quite sure what the word is that I'd use. Uber passionate about space. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Sally Ann. I think the word is space tragic. I think we're all probably one of those. Yeah, great to be here.
I love it. I'm all a fan of space tragics because there's a lot to learn from you. And last but not least, Martin Dersma. Martin's a partner at Main Seekers Ventures. He's got over 25 years experience as a senior executive technologist, business founder, angel investor and mentor. And Main Seekers Ventures, are close friends of Cicada Innovations. We get to care for a couple of their investments here who are residents with us. But Martin, I've known for many years, who's really been pushing hard to grow a deep tech sector in Australia. So it's exciting to have you here today joining us as well, Martin.
Likewise, Sally, and thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. I think we're going to have some great conversation here with all the different people here.
I think so, and I want to get into it and crack on and talk about it and really unlock some practical wisdom and insight, but also some knowledge about the things that you all have in your heads that maybe hasn't been talked about before. But Tim, I'm going to start with you because you've actually worked with so many startups in Australia and space startups. You started an accelerator program here in Sydney for space startups for many years ago. I'd love to hear about some of the innovations that you've seen being developed for space, and not just those innovations, but actually if you can think about the translation of that downstream for businesses. What are the things that you've seen maybe over the last 5 to 10 years that you get really excited about and that you think we all need to get excited about?
Sure. So look, I think we've learned a lot that there's this whole world of downstream space and data, and how we're going to use that data to do things like securitize natural capital, do things like create a massive market for carbon credits, for biodiversity credits. And space is just extraordinary for that. And the things that I've been really struck by is how many skills and talents and capabilities are in the Australian research sector as well as the corporate startup sectors. Things like AI, machine learning, visual processing, and even, one of the more interesting companies that we've seen, Spiral Blue, they've actually taken that processing up to the edge, where the edge is in space. So that instead of taking huge photographs and then beaming those massive photographs down to the Earth, they're actually extracting out the intelligent information from those photographs in the satellite and sending down, the real-time actual decision driving information. So what we're also seeing is there's a whole upstream world where that's really all about the microelectronics. The fact that it used to be that spacecraft are as big as a bus, and now there's some extraordinary instruments that would fit inside your iPhone. And certainly we're seeing spacecraft that are as big as a toaster as test platforms. And so there's university team, for example, at UNSW Sydney, another team at UNSW Canberra. They have both flown spacecraft, and those spacecraft have got multiple sensors inside them that collect data about the Earth, collect data about outer space, or do cool things like send information between spacecraft using lasers, using quantum keys, and there's even folks who are doing microfluidics, where they're using the space environment, both in space and also using zero gravity systems on the Earth to do experiments with how do we create really complex molecules and so on using very, very low gravity environments. So, you name it, we found it. And I think I'd sort of finish this with what's very interesting about space is it seems to integrate all these different disciplines, the law, medicine, physics, chemistry, engineering, and even humanitarian stuff. It all kind of crosses over from this space area.
I love that you actually finished on that point, because I think it's a really interesting one, because we have this perception sometimes of space that if I'm not a aeronautical engineer or a systems engineer, what's my business in space, and how do I get excited and engaged and inspired by it and find a pathway into it? And I mean, that's a beautiful segue to Donna. You're a lawyer. You're a space lawyer, and you've been doing this for 20 years, right? We're only starting to talk about it. Feels a little bit like we're only starting to talk about space in Australia in the last few years. We are a little bit later, maybe, than some other countries in thinking this through. I'd love to get your perspectives on twofold, and I'm going to branch out a little bit in this. Is where do you see as the opportunity and the emerging opportunity now that Australia should participate in, and particularly, I mean, from a sort of a legal perspective and a risk in a perspective, is there anything there that we need to be thinking through and we need to be, concerned about? Because I'm sure there's lots of things that are exciting and emerging, but, just because it's great and it's exciting and it's possible, there is that sort of question about should we? I'd love to just get your perspectives really broadly on your experience in the sector.
Yeah, thank you. They're two really big questions. So what are we good at, and what are the opportunities? And should we be doing these things? What are the ethical, environmental, social, international, legal, equity related questions about this? Because we've got to remember that space is the common heritage of humankind. It is subject to international law. It's a commonly owned area. It's a global commons, and so when we go there, we need to behave responsibly. We need to comply with international law. We need to think about the environment and not create too much space junk and pollution. And we need to think about what's called in international law due regard to the activities of others. And then when you come down to the national level, those international laws are put into our space legislation here in Australia, and then ratchet down even one level more, and then you get into what are the contracts that connect all of these different companies and services and buying and selling, and the sum total of all of that is that space is a very different domain to work in, certainly from a legal perspective, and the risks are managed in a very different way. So my one message as a lawyer is, if you're doing anything in space where you have a component that's going into space, or you're supplying somebody else that is putting something into space, you need to get some advice about the effect of that, because the way that you need to manage those risks in a way that is appropriate for space, because it's completely different from the way things are done on Earth. So if your lawyer is grabbing something off the shelf that is a terrestrial procurement agreement or a sale agreement, it's going to be wrong. It needs to be done differently. So with that said, what are we really good at? There are of course, there's so many different aspects to space, starting from access to space. So one of our advantages is we have quiet skies. We don't have the massive, everyone in the world has quiet skies at the moment, but as a normal matter in Australia, our skies, particularly if you're starting south and flying south, they're a lot quieter than, for example, the skies in Florida. So launch and the ability to set up launch facilities is a great opportunity. And then once you get into space, what are some of the things we're really good at? I'm thinking about Mariota, for example, that has really cutting edge Internet of Things technology, which is a game changer. The way that I know there's a lot of space companies say, oh, we do Internet of Things, but Mariota is doing things in a really different way that is more efficient and more technically efficient and technically effective than anything else that we've seen. Let's go a bit further out. That's in low Earth orbit, all the way out to geostationary orbit. What's a big problem we have here on Earth in Australia is fires. Who can detect fires in real time? Lots of people can detect fires from low Earth orbit satellites because it's not that far away. It's not so hard to see a fire. But detecting it from 36,000 kilometres away so that it's in geostationary orbit and it's in real time, there's only one company in the world, as far as I'm aware, that can do that. And that's a company called Fireball International, which is based in Noosa. Who would have thought? And so they're detecting hundreds of fires in California. They're rolling it out in Australia, but they've been using it for some years in California already. So there's some interesting, just a few little tips I'll throw out there. The standard answer to this question is, oh, we're very good at mining and remote robotics, which we are, but there's a lot more to it.
I love it. There's two things that I think for me that I think are really interesting about your answer is one, you can live in Noosa and have a space company. So Byron Bay, you've got to run for your money on, I'd say right now. And a hot tip on real estate there, clearly, although the Noosa market, I do believe, is already expensive. And two, lawyers or student lawyers at university, go tap on the dean's door and say, where's my space law subject, please? Because, I'm going to graduate and I want to go into this emerging area and this isn't going to cut it for me. It's a growth opportunity. So
exactly. And I would say, my husband and I he was also a space lawyer, wrote an opinion piece in The Australian about a year ago, which is all lawyers are going to have to become space lawyers because so much of our economy is going to touch space in some ways. And you don't just copy, paste from terrestrial to space. You need to do it differently. And so everyone needs to become all the lawyers need to become a bit more space savvy and space literate.
I love it. I would stand behind that. And I'll be asking our lawyer how much he knows about space after today. So if he's watching, you're on notice. James, you are representing the Space Industry Association. You're dealing with industry, you're dealing with space. There's a lot to unpack in just these first two comments already today about the opportunity, about the complexity, about some of the legal and regulatory frameworks. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what the purpose of the association is? And maybe, I don't know, just kind of give us the high level, here's where we need to be headed and this is what everyone needs to know. And because you've got a broad perspective and a broad remit and I'm imagining very busy one.
Yeah, and look, to your point about not being afraid of joining the space industry without any technical qualifications, that's me. So I have no technical qualifications whatsoever, and I'm learning an enormous amount from my board, who are all engineers and scientists and people of terrifying capability. But so the association represents more than 600 members, and just being able to say that is quite an extraordinary thing. So 200 of those are companies. The rest are individuals, and that number's been growing enormously over the last 4 years. And really, the event that catalysed all of this was 4 years ago, the association managed to bid for and win the right to host the biggest space conference in the world in Adelaide. We got 4,000 global space experts to Adelaide, and all of a sudden, the job that we'd been trying to do for 25 years or so, which was to convince the government to set up an Australian space agency, became that much easier. So the last few years, we've been riding the sort of tidal wave of energy and momentum that unleashed in the space industry. And, we have two roles. One is to work internally with our members to help them maximise opportunities and connect them to each other, to overseas opportunities, but also increasingly talk to government on behalf of the industry about where we think things need to go. And to step back and look at the context of Australian space, in the 50s and the 60s, we had this incredible expertise, a lot of international activity here, most of it based around Woomera. Things went a little bit quiet, for the next 40 years or so. We still had Australians going overseas and doing wonderful things and at the forefront of technology. Now we're back in the new space race, but we're a little bit late to the game. And the problem we're trying to confront is, how do we take the enormous array of expertise we have in Australia, commercialise it, scale it into a sustainable industry? And part of the conversation we've been having is really that government's got to set down some big markers here. They've taken some, initial steps, but space is very different to every other industry. The economic multipliers are huge. For every dollar you invest in space, you get between 2 and 10 back. The timelines are quite significant, which makes investing on the scale that you might invest in fintech or another industry, for example, not really applicable to space where the timelines are longer. And as Donna outlined, the strategic, the legal issues are much more significant. Beyond the fact that in the space industry, government is a big customer too. So we're really trying to get the industry development right and make sure that the stuff we're doing here can go to an international market, but can be scaled beyond sort of the startup stage. And there's an enormous amount of investment flying into the Australian space industry at the moment, largely from defence. But we want to make sure that that generates some opportunities for civilian and commercial space too.
I think, thank you for that, because that's a really good comprehensive overview of like, we have had a space sector, we have been quiet, and actually we're back, kind of thing, which I think is a really important narrative for us to actually hear. Because just because things were invisible for a period didn't mean that the talent was disappearing. It just wasn't visible, and it might have been disappearing overseas temporarily. Hopefully we're drawing it all back. There's a really interesting conversation, I think, Martin, to kind of to speak to you and to just echo from James's point about the opportunity and where we're moving into. And 200 companies as members, by the way, is staggering to me. For an industry that is still sort of emerging in Australia, and 600 individuals, that's incredibly high numbers. Martin, what are you seeing with, you've been at Main Sequence Venture. I mean, you've been around for years. You've did a lot of things at Venture. But, I'm not saying you're old or anything, but, you've been at Main Sequence for a while and you've been seeing this. And we've had several conversations over the years about space and emerging companies. What's your view of where we're at? And, what is the opportunity for startups and I guess these smaller and emerging companies and maybe these 400 individuals that are part of James's association, what's the opportunity for them to capitalize and how do they do it? And how do we kind of really take this from nascent to something that's significant and a significant driver of our economy?
Yeah. I think, look, at Main Sequence, we're a venture capital fund and deep tech, and one of the things that we invest in is space. So we get to see a lot of the space startups, and it's interesting. I think over the last few years, we've probably seen over 100 space startups. So a lot come past, and we do a lot of mentoring work helping those space startups. I think some of the challenges are some things that James actually touched on before, which is around that we get lots of space startups that have got cool ideas and great technology. The challenge always is what's the commercial model? So as a venture fund, we're always looking at what's the commercial model behind that can allow them to scale. And I think that's where we're at in an industry perspective right now. We've got lots of small organizations with fantastic ideas. They're generally coming from an engineering and technology perspective. And we're figuring out how these can be applied from a commercialization perspective. Now, on top of that, you've got some fantastic support from government right now and government programs. And so, for example, the Australian space industry, the Australian Space Agency has a number of grants that have been allocated and future ones. So there's the Space Infrastructure Fund, there's the Moon to Mars collaboration, which is $150 million over the next 5 years. For startups and early stage companies, they're building technology that could help NASA in its missions to Moon and Mars. So there are opportunities, for the startups to sort of get some scale. So, I think from an overall perspective, I think there is a lot of money around now through the grants as well as organizations like Main Sequence. But I think one of the other challenges that's probably around at the moment for a lot of the new startups is around talent, right? And, we've, as James said before, we've had, the Australian space industry in the 50s, 60s, we sort of went quiet, and now we're in this ramp up phase right now. At the same time, we've had this COVID situation happen. And so it's harder for people to do the international thing, and so I think the challenge for us right now as we're growing the space sector here is how can we bring up to speed both the newly emerging talent, new graduates that are coming out of our universities. There are a number of space programs and space engineering programs, which is fantastic, and sprinkle that with talent that we can acquire from overseas. Now, I think the good news is that Australia is a very attractive place to move to at the moment. I think globally, people see it as a great place to go, which is fantastic. But we've obviously got to be able to get the right people here to help sort of sprinkle some sort of wiser, experienced space knowledge with our emerging talent that's coming here. And I think that's really what's going to kickstart and put our space industry into high gear.
I think it's a really good point around talent. I want to take that question one step, or take that one step further. And I'm going to throw this open. I'm going to start throwing out my questions open to the panel. So, you know, it's hands on buzzers, first in, best dressed. But, you know, we're happy to take comments from all of you. But, you know, in terms of experience, you know, one of the things that we often sort of see when we talk about the tech sector more broadly, we look to other markets and we look to other locations. Don't use Silicon Valley in your answer, but that's going to be the challenge. But, you know, other places that are doing it well, where we can learn from and the lessons learned, you know, is there some examples of other countries or other, and I'm thinking specifically, I guess, of countries who've done this well and have connected like a nascent sort of space emerging, you know, startup ecosystem with government, with supply chain, with capital? Are there examples that any of you that you can point to and say, this is why this works well, and these are some of the things that we need to think about? Because we all know, I think Australia, you know, one of our challenges is when we don't connect the dots between us, we actually lag behind even slower. So what are some of those examples that we can point to that might, you know, really help us? And I'll throw that up to anybody on the panel that wants to jump in.
I would give an example, and I would say actually every country is struggling with this right now. And the reason is that I think a complete deep tech supply chain requires a whole village. It requires big companies that want to partner with startups and smaller companies and give them contracts that they can use. And that has not been happening very much until very recently. So that whole teaming thing has been a real struggle, I know, from my colleagues in the US. Certainly it's been a struggle in Europe and Japan. And so there's been this disconnect between the old space folks who are used to big budgets, and now governments sort of looking at the new space crowd and saying, my God, these guys are way cheaper. Why are we coming to you? But the big companies, of course, have the incredible capabilities, and they have the cap tables. If you're $1 billion company, well, when you go and get $1 billion contract, that kind of makes sense. If you're a $10 million company, it's difficult for you to credibly go after $1 billion contract, you know? So I think we actually have to possibly look to other ecosystems that for me, there's been a great instructive around the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer picked a startup that happened to be part of an ecosystem and said, you guys have this technology, we think you can crack a COVID vaccine. And literally, we know you could probably do this in a matter of weeks, but we also know that there's no way that you could get it tested and through the authority approval process without $1 billion from us. So let's team up. And that's exactly how it played out. That startup company that happened to have some amazing deep tech capability around molecular dynamics and how they could create a completely different kind of pathway to defeat the virus. They were then embraced by Pfizer, who were dealing with an incredible range of stakeholders at scale. That dynamic is somehow, and you know, there are investors also that were there alongside people like Martin and his ilk, who are like, okay, with this partnership, you're going to be worth this much, so we're going to invest to get you to that next stage. So I think that whole thing of how do we create a TRL ladder, technical readiness ladder, an investment readiness ladder, and a commercial readiness ladder, those three things, that's something that I think every single space ecosystem in the world is trying to figure out right now. And I don't think anyone's cracked it yet, but I'd like to think that Australia could have a go.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's good, Tim. And I think just with Salane, you're asking about some specific country examples. I might call out, say, two countries. One is Canada. And Canada, a number of years ago, did the initiative called the Canada Arm, which is a manipulator that sits on top of the International Space Station, allows you to move spacecraft and materials around. And that was like a big national effort, an actual national pride effort. And if you speak to a Canadian, they'll say, yeah, we did this Canada Arm for the International Space Station, and they feel very proud about it. But what it did is it activated their space ecosystem, because a number of suppliers had to help there, and a whole range of companies, hundreds of companies were involved in that Canada Arm project. So that's an example of an initiative activated an ecosystem. Another good country example is maybe India. You know, India with their launch services, there's a launch services initiative there now. They're a major supplier of launch services, getting satellites up there. And a lot of our startups that are putting small satellites up are using India right now as a way to get satellites up there. And so again, that was an initiative that helped, you know, a range of ecosystem companies around it. So there are a couple of examples where we can look at maybe other countries that are getting successes and learn from those and how we can apply those here in Australia.
And I would say that a big part of it is also the attitude to government to encouraging local industry. So for a long time, the Australian government has had a little bit of cultural cringe when it comes to using Australian technologies, and have instead just taken the easy route, which is going to the big US and European primes to spend their money, rather than perhaps spending a little bit much and developing local capability. And that is coming back to bite in a number of ways. We saw over the last US administration that we couldn't always rely on it. We started to get a hint that, we can't always rely on the US to give us access to capabilities. So I think in defence, but not only in defence, science, a whole range of areas, it's becoming obvious that we need to develop sovereign capability more than we have in the past. And so, yes, we need to look to our international partners and collaborate, but not at the expense of ignoring our sovereign capability. So a lot of it is, Defence is about to spend $7 billion on space technologies. A massive driver of our own industry is how much of that money is going to find its way into local hands and developing local capability.
That's right. James.
Look, that's a great point that Donna makes. I mean, the other country that we can look at is New Zealand, who, have got a small but exquisitely beautiful kind of space industry in what, they've done with Rocket Labs and what they've achieved there. And the sovereign capability point that Donna makes is an interesting one. So, our Defence Department put up a couple of satellites on a mission recently. I think they were originally due to launch last year, and they got bumped off an Indian launch because of COVID constraints. And that's kind of accelerated all of this thinking about, what needs to be sovereign, what doesn't need to be sovereign. And in Australia's case, so much of the space assets we rely on for things from weather to finance to all sorts of transactions are provided to us by other countries, mostly for free. We've been incredibly fortunate for many decades. And now I think we're sort of asking the question, well, can we take that for granted? And what are the risks of taking that for granted?
And one of the risks of taking it for granted is that you just don't get around to developing your own stuff. So you don't develop an industry around observation of the Earth and processing of data if you're just relying on, or at least the space side of the Earth observation. If you're relying on the drug of free data from Japan and other places.
So I want to give you something that one of you sort of mentioned about, during COVID, I think it was you, Martin, that during COVID, one of your companies had to piggyback off India's launch capabilities because we didn't have the capabilities, and it's accelerating things here. It's really interesting when you think about launch capabilities in Australia. We are talking more regional and rural centres, right? We're not talking about Sydney's CBD, or at least as far as I know, I don't have a rocket landing pad right behind me. But, we are talking about areas that are maybe geographically located somewhere slightly different to where the talent pools maybe be. How do we, how do we think about, because the space industry is actually emerging across every state. It does feel like our states are a little bit competitive in what they're trying to achieve and do. And, we are only 25 million people. Could we come together? It would be really nice. But how do we actually, how do you think about some of those challenges between that and capabilities for the sector, across the sector, given the footprint of what we have? I've now just found out about a space company in Noosa. How do we make sure that we're connecting both skills and talent and the labour market across the sector, and not fragmenting it too much in Australia, but connecting the dots and leveraging that, and also the supply chain needed and deploying that? I'd love to get your thoughts, because I think this is one of these complex but beautifully solved. It's a solvable problem, but it's a complex one that we maybe haven't dealt with in Australia yet.
I'm just going to jump in because I know, Martin, I'm sure you've got some great things to say, but I'll just say that although I'm a lawyer, a huge amount of my job has been connecting people and connecting people with jobs, finding expertise, connecting companies with suppliers. connecting companies with buyers. It's funny how much of my time is actually spent doing those email introductions and getting people into business development roles and just trying to get everyone with a bit of space, savvy and nous into the right place. I probably spend more time doing that than I do reading big, fat, boring legal documents.
Yeah, I was just going to say and comment on Sally-Anne about the fact that we do have a bit of state-based rivalry right now, where different states are trying to pull in different parts of the space ecosystem. We've got sort of a bit of a critical mass happening in South Australia around Adelaide, around communications and satellites. You've got some rocket launch capabilities happening in Queensland. You've got other things that are happening in New South Wales. I think we're in this sort of embryonic phase right now where some of these things will settle out, where it'll become natural, where maybe there's enough talent in a certain area that focuses on certain things. I think we're probably going through that for the next couple of years while it settles out. And then I can see the sort of natural centers of excellence that will evolve. You asked about launch earlier, and I think, we touched on sovereign capability in the conversation, and being able to launch satellites, I think, is a critical sovereign capability that Australia needs to be able to do. Space is now a mission critical infrastructure for our society. And so we need the ability to be able to launch small satellites, communications, whatever it needs to be at a moment's notice, because if there are international crises, we can't always rely on our partners. Australia does need to be independent in some of these areas. So I think that's a key capability we need to develop. But by the way, we're also ideally positioned globally to be able to launch satellites because of where we are in the Southern Hemisphere. Our skies are quieter. It's easier to find a slot, as somebody was saying earlier. So, we're actually in a box seat opportunity to have a reasonable launch industry here, as well as a satellite building industry, because you have to put something on the rockets to launch. Well, guess what? We can build interesting advanced satellites for sensing and imaging and a whole range of stuff here. Australia has world-class talent in communications, in sensors and imaging. And, if we harness some of that world-class talent with some of the new satellite capabilities that customers are looking for, we've got a massive opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. The point that you made about Canada is a beautiful one, and I think that we need that kind of forcing function. We're hopeful, and James and I have spoken about this. We do definitely see some of the defence requirements as acting as a forcing function, but we'd also love to see some big civilian missions. So, for example, SmartSat CRC and CSIRO right now are collaborating on a mission called AquaWatch, which is very much about saying, okay, actually, it turns out there's no instruments that are looking at rivers and lakes. And in fact, the key asset that drives contention all around the world. And so we're seeing that Australia could decide to, have a family of these missions and create that same kind of national project like Canada. And then that would act as a forcing function to bring people together and drive those alignments that Martin just described. And then I think we'd be in a different place. So it's a sort of a shakedown. I almost feel like maybe that's the word we're looking for, Martin. It's sort of a bit of a shakedown stage where there's a lot of opportunity and also a lot of folks who are not yet in the space industry who have extraordinary capability in Australia. And we want to roll out the red carpet to them. But it's only really going to make sense and lead to less fragmentation if we have that kind of vision of, okay, these are the things we're going to go for. Let's try and crack next generation Earth observation to solve problems of massive resources, climate change, and AquaWatch, for example, makes a lot of sense as an arid nation, right? So that's just a thought.
James, did you want to chime in here?
Oh, look, so many possibilities. I mean, Tim's right in that, there are all these kind of possible missions. Donna mentioned the fire mission. Tim's mentioned the AquaWatch mission. The journey we're going on now is quite similar to, I think, the journey the cyber industry went on a few years back in Australia, where no one really knew what cyber was. They knew it was a bit of a risk. They kind of didn't know what the opportunities were. Now every company's got some sort of cyber expert. They've got some sort of cyber plan. Across government, there's been a shake-up in the way that, the issue of cyber is dealt with across a whole range of departments at a federal and state level. We're kind of starting to see that sort of thing happening in space, right? So Tim talked about other industries that are going to become part of the space industry because they'll be relying on assets in space, or they'll be using data derived from space, or they'll have their own technology to bring to bear on space problems. We'll see a lot of that. We'll see across government, space systems and data are helping to solve a series of problems. We're already seeing all sorts of problems being solved: agricultural problems from space, land value problems from space, insurance problems from space, tax from space, probably, certainly. So that's the kind of journey we've got to go on. And I want to, I agree with what Martin said and Tim endorsed, which is that, we're in this messy period. The next couple of years is going to be a bit messy. There's going to be a bit of jockeying, a bit of uncertainty. As someone who's new to the industry, it's taken me 6 months just to kind of get my arms around it and know where all the bits and pieces are. And that's okay, that's going to continue. But from that period on, we'll start to see, okay, this is where Australia is going to generate critical mass. These are the areas, the functional areas or the technological areas or the service areas where we're going to have critical mass and where we're going to be internationally competitive and where we're potentially going to be able to export into other markets as well. So I think this is the right time to be kind of talking to people who may not have thought about space before and getting them switched on to the possibilities.
I think that's a really important point that you just made then about getting the people switched on who may not have thought about it. We had a conversation amongst the team yesterday as we were thinking about today and preparing about it. And, my reflection was, having been in computer science sort of and in software engineering, was it feels like space is the next AI or ML conversation. So you've mentioned cyber. It's kind of like it took a really long time for business in Australia to sort of adopt. And we know business in Australia has been traditionally very slow to adopt digital technologies, cyber, machine learning, AI, things like that. Is there a call that we should be making to the top end of town to be like, you need a chief space officer to start thinking about space in your business? I mean, is that something we should be thinking about and challenging them with and going, banking, hey, do you realize how much data that you have and your needs are going to be reliant on space and satellite technology? Have you ever thought about, is someone in your business who is responsible? I'm totally off script here, but it's a really interesting one to think about from a governance perspective, from an investments perspective, from a board perspective. Where is that knowledge? And should we be pushing, the AICD and others in the top end of town to be thinking about space capable, space knowledgeable executives in their business? Open for thoughts.
I mean, that's such a fascinating idea. Thinking from the perspective of self-interest of our members, I'd say no, you should go one of our members for their space expertise and services. But I think it will become more of a factor. People will need to understand their space dependencies. You'll need to have visibility at a board level. I mean, the chat, someone's talked about 6G and sort of where that kind of technology is going and what that might mean. So that's going to increase reliance on space sensors. As an association, we see the need for more executive education on space, both in the private sector and in government, and we're looking to meet that need, and there are others looking to meet that need as well. So, I think we need to skill up our broader workforce on space, but then we come back to that problem that a few of the other speakers touched on, which is, where is the talent coming from for all of this? So the government's committed to grow the space sector from 10,000 to 30,000 jobs. That's a lot of jobs, and we're producing some graduates in space relevant disciplines each year, but we don't have dedicated pathways at a tertiary level or indeed at a vocational education level to get people into space.
And there has been a bit of a push to start creating space courses here and there, but in some cases, they're being taught by people who've never done space. So it's one of the tricky things is that certain space technologies, and I'll also, talk about space law is one of those disciplines that needs to be, I think, taught by people who have done it, not just someone who's kind of picked up the treaties and had a think. But there is, because a lot of this technology is dual use, it's export controlled. And so sometimes we do have some fantastic people who have deep expertise in the US. They're desperate to share it and come and live in Australia and either teach or work in the industry, but they're then prevented by the US government. So that's a big role for the space agency to help sort out to kind of stop that blockage.
Yep, that's right. Second that, Donna. I'd like to sort of say one other thing. So you're asking about whether a company needs a chief space officer or somebody aware about space. I'd like to turn that into a supply chain statement, because what we're also seeing is that in a number of our startups that are looking to build space satellites or rockets or whatever they're doing, there's not enough awareness in the Australian advanced manufacturing sector that they could actually be a space supplier. And so some of the work that's going on right now is, some of our early stage companies might be approaching an advanced manufacturing company somewhere else in Australia saying, hey, by the way, can you make these tanks for me? Or can you do these nozzles for me? And that company had no idea they could be a space supplier. So there's a little bit of that education that is going on as well. And generally when these sort of supply chain companies are approached, they're very excited. Hey, yeah, we'd love to supply you tanks or nozzles or things or valves or pumps, for your rocket or whatever else you're doing in space. So there's a bit of cross education that we need on the supply chain as well. And I think the raising of the awareness of space as an industry and an opportunity, some of the publicity and the noise that we're seeing in press is going to help raise that awareness and hopefully make it some of these companies that are doing advanced manufacturing think about, hey, maybe I could be a supplier to the industry.
Great question. I'm cognizant that we're getting a couple of questions coming in on the chat, which I'll try and get to in a second. But I think speaking of that, right, that's a connecting the dots problem, and it's an activity or something to kind of surface that conversation and connect the dots. What are the programs, activities? I mean, there's a lot going on that government started doing, but what's missing? What are the programs or activities that I'll throw this to all of you, that you think still need to be done? And that, could be done to unite people, unite opportunities and stakeholders in this space, because it is such an opportunity that we don't want to miss out on. What are we missing doing? Budget's coming. I'm sure it's not too late to slip an idea in. I mean, it probably is, but let's go with it's not. What are we missing that needs to happen that will help kind of more of this cluster effect happen, do you think?
I'll throw in one thing, which is probably not the main game, but it's an obstacle we need to work on. So the main game is going to be how do we get money into these and cooperation. And I'll let the other chaps talk about that, because that's what they really know about. But one little nerdy problem that is, I think, going to be a problem down the track for making a widespread successful industry is getting everybody comfortable with the way legal risks are managed in space. And sorry if that's a bit tedious for some people, but there's a thing called a cross waiver, which needs to be in space contracts, and it needs to be flowed down. So the idea is if I'm launching your spacecraft and I break it along the way, you're not going to sue me, you're not going to sue my suppliers, you're not going to sue the other customers whose satellite might have blown up, and you're going to make sure that your suppliers, customers, investors don't sue me. So when you take that all the way back, it ends up being the entire ecosystem that needs to get their head around this, including government. So one of the problems that held up the US private space industry for a long time was the fact that there was always someone who would go, well, that's not in my policy, and so I'm not going to sign that cross waiver, either in government or in some big company, and it blocked everything. So the way they solved that problem in the US was to make it compulsory. So it's built into their legislation. We don't have that here. And I don't think we need it to be compulsory, but we do need everyone to get on board, including government, including particularly the Department of Finance, which is often the source of these policies that block things all the way down. But that's, going back to your chief space officer idea, Sally, that would be one role of the chief space officer would be making sure that everybody who's involved in the space venture signs cross waivers and gets all their suppliers and customers to sign them.
Love it. What else do we need to do, team? This is the brains trust here for Australia's space industry.
Look, I think one of the points we've been reminding people of recently is, a recent study done of the G20 countries looking at their levels of civilian investment into space found that Australia was 18th of 20, equal 18th. So the only country that spends less from a government perspective on space than us is Mexico, and they've just announced some big programs to invest in space. And to put that into comparison, Canada, the great example that Martin was talking about before, I think 5 times as much on a relative GDP basis invested in space as the Australian government. Indonesia and South Africa are doing more than us. So, we're kind of talking a big gain on space at the moment, but we haven't quite matched that with investment. The government's been on a journey here. They made a small investment in 2017. They'll review that in the first couple of years of operation of the Space Agency over the next 12 months. And, I'd be very surprised if they didn't find that that's been a positive experience. Now, what's the sort of decade-long kind of investment plan looks like that gives industry some certainty, that addresses some of those missions that we've talked about, and that can really help us start to form critical mass? That's the kind of question we're asking.
I think you're spot on there, James. I think it's that investment plan plus getting agreement around a couple of big missions that help drive that flywheel in industry, get all the supply companies, get everyone collaborating. I think that's the critical thing that we're missing right now.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity. I think if we, probably doubled the amount of money that we're putting on the table right now, which is the feedback certainly we're getting from folks that we're on a journey, but we probably need to double it for the stage that we're at. And I think we also need, there is a big problem with early stage funding. Most of the early stage government money has actually come from defense. We've got a number of great startups that would not have survived if it wasn't for defense money. There was no civilian money, and there was no state money. SmartSet CRC, we're now running an experiment here in New South Wales of funding demonstrators, co-funding those demonstrators. In the US, they have had a very successful program called SBIR, where government agencies are mandated to spend a certain amount of their budgets on SMEs, as in acquisition of services and products from SMEs. So we're not yet seeing governments, even the Australian Space Agency does not buy generally services of any kind yet, doesn't actually say, right, we want to buy this system off you to deliver this mission for Artemis. That's not how they're operating at all. Not that sort of, I'm going to give you a contract to buy X off you, and I'm not going to give that to one of the big companies. They can be an advisor, but I'm going to actually explicitly buy it from a small company to help drive you up through that ladder of capability and investment value and so on. We're not yet seeing that. And I think we're hearing good noises. There's a national challenge that we've got to do, which we sit right squarely in, and Martin does too in his role with CSIRO main sequence, which is research commercialization. How do we scale things? How do we sort of take an amazing bit of technology that is coming out of the hands of our actually amazing, I'm a commercial person, my background is in industry, I've been blown away with how great some of the technologies you find in university are and how readily they could be adopted. We still need to learn that skill of saying, here's this extraordinarily groundbreaking technology that could transform, let's say, noise reduction in RF communications globally. Let's scale it to this level globally right away. Let's not tinker. And I think we spent a lot of time tinkering and then giving up at that stage. So certainly the headline, I think we need to roughly double what we're spending on this stuff to make it able.
Just to comment on what you just said about scaling technology from universities, that's essentially what Fireball International is doing. The Noosa company I mentioned earlier, they are identifying technologies that they're finding in universities, both in Berkeley University and in the US and in Queensland University, and commercializing that. So, but I think we do have a go-to-market gap. We need to get better at that process, that conveyor belt of find customers, sign them up, get them, start selling them stuff.
Yeah, I think these are really great points, and we'll be making sure that we send it on to a few people, going just a few suggestions for some policy levers and things that might enable us to get out and do the things that we all do well, which is build science and engineering based businesses, and in this case space-based businesses. We are really close to time, but I want to ask you all one question, and to me this is the action question, the call to action for anybody who's, participated today or who's watching this online in the future. What is the one thing that you'd want people to walk away from today knowing and maybe or doing to engage in this sector, because I do think it's really exciting. I do think there's incredible opportunity. I think we've got the smarts and we've got the know-how. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of gaps that we've talked about, and there's a lot of things that we can do. But, you know, we might just go down the line. I'll do Donna, James, Tim, and Martin. You know, what's the one thing that you want people to take away or do to engage in this, and to make sure that this isn't just an interesting session that they've watched or participated in, but there's a call to action to do from here. Donna.
Well, my call to action as a lawyer is just for everyone to remember that space is not the wild, wild west. It is a legally governed space, and there are ways that things need to be done legally. So that's just from the legal side. From the broader side, I think it's worthwhile everybody just having a little think about what are my capabilities here in my terrestrial business, and what are my skills and how might they be applied? Because just like all lawyers are going to need to become space lawyers, all accountants are going to have to become space accountants. You know, we're going to need tax professionals, we're going to need dentists, we're going to, you know, there's going to be we need to think through the space implication of everything we do. And an example, for, you know, just, of course, my examples tend to be on the legal side because that's where I operate. But if you're a patent lawyer, have a think about this. The Patent Act in Australia expressly does not apply in space. So there's a little problem we need to work around. Maybe we need to amend it, maybe as the US did. But if you're a patent lawyer, you need to start thinking about, does everything I do need to be done differently when you do it in space?
Thank you. James?
So, I mean, other than becoming a member of what you think is your preeminent professional space association, you know, I think the interesting question that I've been asked a couple of times since I've been in this job and that people should ask themselves is, would I go to space? And, you know, that is not an abstract question because as Tim has reminded me a number of times, we're now widening the aperture on the number of people that we need to think about sending to space. And Donna talked about it just then, space dentists. You know, for a period of time, you could only go to space as an astronaut if you had never suffered a broken bone in your body. That was the criteria for going to space. And then, what was it, a decade ago, that US billionaire Dennis Tito, at the age of 67, got himself launched into space on a Russian rocket after some modification to his lungs to make him sort of more of a chance of returning from space. The European Union has just announced that they will take para or disabled astronauts into their next intake. So the question of, do you want to go to space? Do you want to be operating on the moon in whatever your profession is in the next 20 years is a very real one that people should think about.
Awesome. I love that. Tim?
Okay, so I think, you know, we're at this stage, you might remember the world before the internet. Some of us are old enough to remember the world before the internet and the world that we're in today. I believe that the impact of space is going to be that transformative to life on Earth in so many ways. So the action is, imagine a day without any space services. Pick up your phone and think about all the things that wouldn't work. The clock wouldn't work, your map to call your Uber wouldn't work. You wouldn't necessarily even have a proper map. You're going to have, you're not going to have a communication network that allows you to call anyone else in the world. You're not going to be streaming your Netflix in the same way. There's all sorts of things that just don't work. Perhaps you won't even be able to have as nutritious and food or clean water or even electricity at the price that you need, all those things. So imagine a day without space, and how would we survive?
Well, we wouldn't have a super soaker either. So it wouldn't be very fun. Martin, final words to you.
Just a quick one from me. Look, space is a large and growing commercial opportunity. It's going to be important. It's also very inspiring to our youth. So my call to action is, if you're a parent and you've got kids that are growing up, talk to them about space. Tell them about how awesome it is, the wonder of space. Get them involved in the sort of activities around space, and they're going to become the future talent that are going to build our space industry.
Fantastic. Well, look, I just want to thank each and every one of you, our panelists today, Donna, James, Tim, and Martin. I've learnt a lot. I love hosting these conversations because, you know, it's lovely that we have an audience and there's other people out there that watch this afterwards and participate. But quite frankly, selfishly, I get to learn a lot and actually get my perspective and my understanding of a sector and a space broadened. And I've definitely had that done today. So I just want to thank you so much for your time and your contributions and your commitments. And also thank you for what you're doing in actually leading the sector and leading the opportunities for not just people today, but actually generations to come in this sector. I think it's really incredible work. It's really tough work. It's work that takes commitment, and it takes, you know, such a lot of effort, particularly, you know, Donna, if you're dealing with regulatory environments and trying to change things in Canberra, more power to you. You know, thank you. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your wisdom. I want to thank you for enthusiasm and passion in this space. And for all of you who have joined us today or are watching us, you know, online, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for being part of this conversation and this dialogue. Thank you for being part of the space sector in Australia. You're on the hook now. So you need to learn more, you need to grow more, and you need to participate in helping us build the industry that we want to see in Australia. We at Cicada Innovations are really proud and privileged to be able to host conversations like this about emerging deep tech opportunities and you know, programs like this. And we want you to be part of our community. We want to connect you with the people like our panelists today. And connect you with the work that's happening here, but more broadly across the ecosystem, and help us actually make Australia an economy that is thriving because we've got deep tech businesses that are founded in science and engineering that are solving some of the world's most pressing problems. We can't do it in and of ourselves, and we can't do it without you. So we'd love to be connected with you. We'd love you to sign up to our newsletter. If you want to just scan the QR code there, that'll take you right to our newsletter and you can sign up and stay connected. And we hope that you'll be able to join us in our next conversation and our future events where we sort of dive into things in this sector. There'll be more on space, there'll be more on medtech, there'll be things on agtech, IoT. We've got some really awesome things coming up, and we really just want to thank you for participating today and really hope to see you in the future. Thanks. Bye for now.